Thank you and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for allowing us the opportunity to come and speak to you. My name is Terrence Shaw. I'm the Manager of Environmental Services at the Pasqua Hospital, and we have a technical problem. And this is our patient advocate from RPIW number 102, Perry Dales. I had the pleasure of being one of the co-leads of RPIW number 102, which was to attempt to eliminate defects in the isolation process. And I'd just like to share some of the learnings that I came away with from this RPIW. When Robbie Peters and I first started in this RPIW, we had to deep dive into the isolation process so that we as non-clinicians could have a good understanding of the overall process and to have a better understanding of where defects could happen. Wow, were we ever in for an education. We had to stop and examine the series of potential defects several times and refocus to make sure that we were going to get some real value from this work, and to realize that with the limited time that we had, we could not even attempt to address every opportunity for defect. There were several hard questions we had to determine, like what is the real risk to these problems? Quite frankly, I think we were feeling a little bit overwhelmed with the enormity of the process. To make this clear, we drew a diagram of how many people this problem would touch. I know the diagram isn't great, but it's a simple diagram, but a big problem. As we discovered that a defect in the isolation process affected a lot of people in and out of our workplace, from the caregivers at bedside to every staff member who touches that patient, and there are a lot of people who do touch that patient, to visitors and volunteers, to even our loved ones at home. We then had to understand what is the real cost to this problem. As it turned out, not really difficult to get that information. We are fortunate in the RQHR to have an epidemiologist and medical microbiologist who are able to provide some really scary information. Yeah. In 2015, the RQHR had 456 hospital-acquired infections, which harmed people, and while doing so has cost our healthcare system almost $7 million in associated costs. That grabbed our attention really quickly. I thought to myself, surely that has to be a mistake because I haven't really heard about it on the news or read about it in our newspapers. And for those of you who have heard Dr. Minion's talks on what's upcoming with new antibiotic-resistant organisms, you really know what I mean about frightening information. The AROs that we have now, those AROs that can dramatically alter a person's life, are not even the most scary ones out there. We said to ourselves that we really need to get this process right now. We also learned that by concentrating on some good basic principles and practices, we could prevent a lot of these hospital-acquired infections. Our IPIW team decided that we could see improvement by increasing the effort to give in to those basic practices, by making the infection control process more clear, with easier to follow signage, coming soon. Making sure that everyone knows when and how to wash our hands. Now, as a former chef, that's something I really do understand. You don't handle raw chicken and then touch cheese without washing your hands in between. All you're going to do is make someone sick. Now, as hand washing is one of the simplest things and most important things that you can do to prevent the spread of infection, I wanted to make sure that my team got the message. You can see everyone trying to get out of the way of the camera there for sure. This is really how my team starts every single shift. We're attempting to build muscle memory by doing the right thing at the right time without having to think about it too much. I frankly don't remember a whole bunch of my grade 9 algebra class, but I certainly remember what we talked about and what we did at Huddle today. Making sure that we talk about good foundational practices as well. I'm sorry. We actually taught Robbie Peters and our patient advocates how to wash their hands as well. It's really nice to see a leader walk the talk. Making sure that we talk about good fundamental practices. By talking about them every single day, we have a better chance of reinforcing those fundamentals. And lastly, making sure that we give our patients, our partners in care, our patients and their family the information that they need to understand how to help themselves during their healthcare journey, both in our facilities and at home, and making sure that no one else comes to harm. That face-to-face transfer of information was a really strong theme from our patient advocates. You can see some standard work there. I am really happy to report that almost a month after this RPIW, that both of the RPIW test units have improved their hand washing results and had much fewer isolation areas, and we are continuing to see improvements. However, that really isn't the biggest takeaway that I took from this RPIW. The biggest learning that I took out of this was the human cost to these defects in the isolation process. And until I got to actually work with our patient advisors and hear their journeys through our healthcare system, that I was able to put a face on them and was really able to realize the true cost of these defects. I would really like to introduce our patient advocate, Perry Dales, and would like to recognize and commend him for his willingness to share his story. I'm not so sure I'd have the courage to have his positive attitude and willingness to help a team that had caused me harm. Perry Dales, ladies and gentlemen.
Before I start, I have a personal goal today that I'm going to try to stand as long as I can, but rather than fall, I will sit down if I have to. So first of all, I want to wish to thank you all for inviting me to your Managers Forum. I'm humbled and honored. There is only one reason I have agreed to share my story, and I sincerely hope that we can prevent anything that happened to me happening to someone else. My journey begins in early 2014, a time when my wife was just finishing radiation treatments. I was determined to be the best support I could be, but unfortunately I became ill and ended up in the hospital. Between January and August of that year, I was in and out of the hospital a lot. I had acquired a hospital infection, and like everyone else who comes to the hospital, I came to get treated and get well, but left feeling guilty that it was my fault I got the infection. By mid-September, I was back in the hospital, this time in intensive care. My family was called and advised I may not make the night. My diagnosis was sepsis shock, heart failure, stroke, and kidney failure. With my creatinine levels approaching 1,000, I was transferred to the general hospital. By this time, I had 2 to 3 days of fluid overload in my body. And my body at that time began to give out. Due to the stress and infections, I developed a huge blood-filled blisters, and my appearance was gross. My condition was unknown, and some staff at that time refused to provide care. The dermatologist, I'm sure, explained what bulitis was, but I was just too sick to understand. Frustration turned to anxiety for myself and my family. Our questions were not being answered. At one time, one staff member handed me their cell phone and advised me to research the WebMed for what I had. I was far too sick to find any answers or to understand any answers that I found. My wife and I were so desperate for answers that we looked for any clue from any medical staff. I felt dirty, ashamed, and actually begged my family not to come and visit me. I didn't want to embarrass them. It didn't help that when I wanted to rent a TV and was refused because I was on isolation, I felt like I was in isolation. After a 30-day stay, I was told that I was discharged because my 30-day stay time was up. You were limited 30 days, and after 2 days at home, I was back in the ER and had to start the process all over again. At registration, I disclosed that I had a hospital-acquired infection, but it was not in the system. I was placed in a bed in the hallway, having to use a public washroom. I was finally transferred to a private room in ER. The room was dark, the rails were up, and I couldn't find the call bell. Of course, in the middle of the night, I had to go. So I decided I could scale the rails. I fell on my head and developed a large bump and a stutter that I was not, very few people could understand what I was saying. I had to start speech therapy and was transferred up to the ward and then was discharged shortly after. During my stay, more tests were run, and I found that I had acquired yet another hospital infection. No one told me what was going on or what I had. The only way I knew was when the staff changed the signs outside my door. After a short time, I was back in the hospital. Many of the patients on the unit came to me for help, in desperation, I'm sure, because they felt that they were not being heard and didn't know who to go to for help. I felt that the stress really impeded my recovery. It was all very overwhelming, and I eventually I went back home. Again, I felt that I had brought on the hospital infections, and no one has told me any different. In fact, it even carried over to our personal friendships. Some feared of getting the infections from me and no longer really associated. Through observation, my wife and I followed hospital routine, thinking that it should apply at home. We were forgetting that at the hospital they travel from patient to patient, and at home we don't. But the plan was I would sleep alone. My laundry was washed and dried separately. I was isolated to one washroom. The bathroom would have to be bleached twice daily, because that's what they did in the hospital. My chair would have to be wiped with alcohol after each use, and home care would be required. It became evident chances to return to work were getting slim. It was recommended that I not travel further than 45 kilometers from Regina. All of this became such a burden that I asked for a visit to a psychologist and stayed in therapy for a year. At this point, I sent my concerns to the patient advocate. I felt labeled because I forwarded my concerns. Each time I went back to the hospital, and there were many, I worried that my care would change, and it did. Not for the better, I might add. Recently, I was part of an RPIW, and it was great, a very great experience. One opportunity for improvement I noticed was when a manager for a unit said she usually doesn't visit isolation rooms. It brought all those feelings back to me again. But on a positive note, it's great to see that the units have increased their hand washing by 3% in 1 month. All the hard work was paying off. Today, I'm still isolated to one bathroom at home that my wife washes down regularly. Laundry is washed separately, and the rituals continue. All the therapy that I had received has not changed my mind about feeling guilty, frustrated, and embarrassed about those infections. My youngest daughter hasn't hugged me in over 2 years, and that really hurt. But I try to remember that I have received some good care, as I have managed to stay out of the hospital for most of 2016. In fact, I was able to cut my own grass twice this year, and that was an accomplishment. I am fortunate to have 5 doctors involved in my care, and I'm delighted that I can travel to the treatment center for my weekly infusions and blood transfusions as required. Let's not forget that we have an amazing infection control department who are willing to share information. I wish I had their number earlier. I'm honored to be part of presenting at this management forum, and it's amazing to see so many dedicated and knowledgeable professionals in one room. So what is the cost to me? Every day, I fight to survive, swallowing 25 plus pills and relying on 100 units of insulin. Please don't share another infection with me. I'm not sure I could survive. But really, I don't want to find out. Someday, I hope my daughter will hug me again, and I also hope that we will soon achieve 100% compliance in hand washing. I feel confident it is not a case of not knowing when we need to wash, but then again, I don't understand why we are discussing washing hands today. In closing, I'm asking you to please remember that I'm just one patient who has acquired hospital infections, and we all know there are more out there. While I realize that no one makes a conscious decision to harm patients, I'm still a victim of someone choosing not to wash their hands. Thank you so much for listening, and cheers.